Okay, module 38, excuse me, on adolescence. So adolescence is this period of time between childhood and adulthood. And again, we're going to talk about the physiological developments that occur, the cognitive developments, and then also the social developments that occur. So again, we'll talk about Erikson's psychosocial theory of development and the stages that occur during adolescence. So the two major, well, one question we're going to answer in this chapter is what major physical, social, and cognitive transitions actually characterize adolescence. And to go along with this, adolescence itself is the developmental stage between childhood and adulthood. All right, so let's talk about the physical changes that occur in adolescence. The physical changes that we see in adolescence are actually quite dramatic. If you remember when we talked about childhood, and there were all of those changes that occurred during that first year of life. And then it starts to slow down some at around age 6, I'd say, and it doesn't pick up again until adolescence. And then during adolescence, you see this big growth spurt and all of these physiological changes that again occur. So the growth spurt occurs for girls around age 10 and for boys around age 12. In girls, you start to see the development of breasts, and in boys, you see the deepening of their voices, body hair, and intense sexual feelings. Puberty is this demarcation for when adolescence kind of occurs. And puberty is the period at which maturation of the sexual organs occurs. So for girls, this is around 11 or 12 years old, and for boys, this is 13 or 14 years old. And the sexual maturation that we're talking about is for girls, it's menstruation when they get their first menstrual cycle. And for boys, it's called spermarchy when they have their first ejaculation, or their first wet dream is usually what it's in the media referred to as. So we always think of puberty, or we always think of adolescence as starting at age 13. But adolescence textbook-wise occurs when puberty occurs. And for girls, that could be 11 or 12 years old when they get their first menstrual cycle. So for girls, that's when adolescence occurs by textbook standards. A lot of people think of adolescence, like I said, though, is 13 years old, but that's not always the case for girls. Now, this figure you can actually see on page, let me get to the right page here. This is at the top of page 403 in your textbook. And you can see it's the range of ages during which major sexual changes occur during adolescence, and it's shown by the colored bars. So this is for males on the top and average females on the bottom. So the growth spurt, for all of these, females develop at a fast or an earlier age than what it does for males. So growth, height spurt, penis growth, first ejaculation, and pubic hair for males. For females, it's height spurt, onset of menstruation, breast development, and pubic hair for all of those. So with females, it's this very kind of short period of time. And for males, it occurs later in age and for a longer period of time, except for everything except for penis growth. Everything else is kind of is for a couple of years that you actually see this. Now, on the next two slides, I want to talk about moral and cognitive development in males and females, because this is a very big part of adolescence, is distinguishing right from wrong. The well-known researcher that we know of when we talk about morals is Lawrence Kohlberg. According to him, there are changes in moral reasoning that can be best understood at a 3-level sequence. So these are the levels of moral development that Kohlberg said adolescents go through. There are 3 different levels, and we're going to talk about each of those on the next slide more in depth. But there is the pre-conventional morality level, there is the conventional morality level, and there is the post-conventional morality level that Kohlberg said we actually go through as adolescents. One difficulty with Kohlberg's theory, though, is that it pertains to moral judgments, not moral behavior. So keep that in mind as we're talking about this sequence, because remember, this is cognitive development. So it is moral judgments or decisions that the adolescent makes and not their moral behavior. Now, those moral judgments could affect their behavior, definitely, but we are talking about the moral judgments that Kohlberg came up with. So the moral and cognitive development, distinguishing right from wrong. And I want to go in more in depth into these 3 levels that we just mentioned. So level 1 is the pre-conventional morality level. The main consideration here is the avoidance of punishment and the desire for rewards. So this usually occurs at a very young age that you see this. And there's actually a table at the top of page 405 that is very helpful for you to look at with this. Level 2 is the conventional morality level. This is where membership in society becomes important. People behave in ways that will win the approval of others. And then level 3 is the post-conventional level. So people accept that there are certain broad principles of morality that should govern our actions. And these principles are more critical than laws in society. Now, in your book on page 404 and 405, Kohlberg did a study looking at these conventional levels, and it's called the Heinz dilemma. So in this situation, you can read about that. It was a guy whose name was Heinz, and his wife was dying of cancer, and he wanted to get this drug that would save her. However, the drug was very expensive, and he tried to raise enough money, but he couldn't. He asked the druggist to let him make a payment plan, so on and so forth, but the druggist said no. And so Heinz didn't want his wife to die. So later on that night, he broke into the drugstore and he stole the drug so that his wife would not die. So Kohlberg then talks about this moral dilemma that we go through, right? Should Heinz steal the drug? Should he not steal the drug? So if you look at figure 2 at the top of page 405, it talks about the 3 different levels of Kohlberg's, and at each level, whether or not Heinz should steal the drug. So this Heinz dilemma is very well known in psychology whenever we talk about any type of moral reasoning. Now, one of the shortcomings of Kohlberg's, besides it dealing with moral judgment and not moral behavior, another shortcoming is that he primarily used male participants in his study. Well, a more recent researcher came along, Carol Gilligan, and she argued because of the different socialization, women and men view moral behavior differently. So she argued that it wasn't right that he only used males. You know, males and females look at morals differently. And so men view it primarily in terms of broad principles, such as justice and fairness. However, females look at it in terms of responsibility toward others and a willingness to make sacrifices. So this is more along the lines of morality of caring. And whenever she did the study, she found things a little bit different. And so you can read about that on at the bottom of page 405 in the research that Carol Gilligan did. So in the teenage years, there are certain questions that assume special significance for adolescents, such as, who am I? How do I fit into this world? And what is life all about? Right? We don't think about these three questions so much as children, but we definitely start to contemplate them more so as adolescents. And then these carry on more so definitely into adulthood. There are still times that I myself in middle adulthood am asking myself these three questions. But we really start to think about these questions in our teenage years. Well, these three questions then lead to Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. Now, remember, we talked about Erikson's theory of psychosocial development previously in children. Now we're going to come back to Erikson's theory of psychosocial development in adolescence. And we have two more roles that we look at. And both of these look at identity. Now, this leads to those previous three questions that we just saw on the other slide. Who am I? How do I fit into the world? And what is life all about? So when we're talking about identity, it's distinguishing the character of the individual, who each of us is, what our roles are, and what we are actually capable of. That's what we start to think about in adolescence. So one of Erikson's levels that comes about is identity versus role confusion. In adolescence, it's a major testing to determine your unique qualities. If you are able to do this and you know who you identify as, then that's great. However, if you don't develop and realize who you are, your identity, then you have this role confusion stage. So again, remember, Erikson is this versus that. So you either realize your identity or you have this role confusion. We also have a second of Erikson's levels, and that is intimacy versus isolation that we see with this. This is a period during early adulthood that focuses on developing close relationships. And I say early adulthood even though we're talking about adolescence. So you want to develop these close relationships with other individuals. Now, I want to continue talking about Erikson's theories, which go into adulthood, which we're kind of talking about adolescence. So it's a little bit confusing why we're talking about them here, but that's what the author of this book did, and they just continued on with Erikson's theory. So we say that notably, Erikson's theory suggests that development does not stop at adolescence or even early adulthood. It continues on into middle and late adulthood. And we have these two other levels that Erikson came up with. So one is generativity versus stagnation. So when something's stagnant, it remains the same. We think about stagnant water. That is non-moving water, and it becomes stagnant or stale or gross, right? So generativity versus stagnation. This is a period in middle adulthood during which we take stock of our contributions to family and society. What have we been contributing? Have we been generating things in our life? If not, then perhaps we've just been stagnant and not doing the things that we wanted to do. And then we also have ego integrity versus despair. And this is a stage that we see in late adulthood until death. And it's where we review our life's accomplishments and failures. Did we set out to do the things we did, or that we wanted to, and did we do them? If we didn't accomplish all those goals or all those life streams that we had, then we have this despair. Like, what have I done with my life? I wanted to do this and I wanted to do this, but I've done none of that. And now here I am at the end of my life and I can't go back and do that. So these are Erikson's stages. Now, this table, figure 3, is on page 406 at the bottom, and you can see a picture of Erik Erikson there also. But this table kind of sums up all of Erikson's stages. It gives the stage, it gives the approximate age of that stage, the positive outcomes, and then the negative outcomes. So the positive outcomes would be this or that, the negative outcomes. You either want to accomplish these things or you're going to be stuck with these things, right? So I think it's a really good it's a really good table to kind of break down all of Erikson's stages so that they're talked about more in depth. And you can think about where you are at your life right now and have you done the things that you wanted to do. Now, we tend to think of adolescence as this horrible time where, kids get, they're bad, they're fresh, no one understands them. It's just this horrible time. And so, is there a stormy adolescence? Is that a myth or is it actually a reality? The reality is that most young people do pass through adolescence without any great turmoil, right? There are some individuals that definitely do, but for the majority of adolescents, they don't go through all this turmoil that the media likes to think that they go through. We have adolescent egocentrism. Remember, we talked about egocentrism in childhood. Well, we also have this adolescent egocentrism, and this is the state of self-absorption in which a teenager views the world from his or her own point of view, right? So again, you kind of come back to this egocentrism where, no one understands what you're going through, and it's either your way or not this way. I remember one of my nieces was very much like this. Every time you said something to her, she'd be like, you just don't understand. You have no idea what I'm going through right now, right? As though we weren't also teenagers at one point in time. Adolescents also develop these personal fables. And this is the belief that one's experience is unique, exceptional, and shared by no one else. That's kind of what I just explained with my niece. Adolescents also seem to take part in these risky behaviors. And that is due in part to the immaturity of the brain systems that regulate impulse control. Your brain does not fully stop developing until you're in your 20s. So there is a very big part of time with risky behavior where your brain is still developing. Now, I do want to spend some time talking about adolescent suicide, because there is a big problem in our society right now where there is an increase in adolescent suicide. Research has shown that suicide is the second leading cause of death among individuals between the ages of 10 and 17. That is only followed by accidents. Accidents is the number one cause of death, and adolescent suicide is the second leading cause of death in individuals between the ages of 10 and 17. That reported rate may actually be underrated or understated. It may actually be even higher than that. As many as 200 individuals may attempt suicide for every one who actually takes his or her own life. So every one person who actually has a successful suicide, there are 200 others that have attempted suicide. Males are 5 times more likely to commit suicide. However, females attempt it more. So females actually attempt suicide more often than males. They're just not as successful at it as males are. Easy access to weapons is definitely a factor. How easy you have access to a gun maybe increase the chances that you will have a successful suicide. Bullying is also a very big factor when it comes to teenage suicide. And suicides sometimes occur in clusters, where you may see more than one individual at a time committing suicide, or shortly one, then another, and then another. There are various warning signs for teenage suicide, and I have some of the ones listed here that they talk about in the chapter. So things like school problems, frequent incidences of self-destructive behavior, loss of appetite or excessive eating, withdrawal from their friends and peers. They may have sleeping problems, signs of depression. They cry a lot. They have an overt indication of psychological difficulties. They may have this preoccupation with death. They tend to put their affairs in order, and this explicit announcement of suicidal thoughts. If you hear any of these, you need to take it very seriously. Don't just assume that it is a stage that they are going through. These have been shown as warning signs, and again, they need to be taken very seriously. Now, this slide is taken out of your book. This slide is found at the top of page 410. And you can see that according to a review of phone calls to one telephone helpline, adolescents who were contemplating suicide most often mentioned family, peer relationships, and self-esteem problems. So along the x-axis, it is the percentage of calls mentioning the concern. And along the y-axis are those actual concerns. And you can see family problems is one of the highest. There are more calls to a prevention hotline about family problems than about anything else. And then it gets to peer relationships, self-esteem. Sometimes they just want to talk, drugs and alcohol, abuse, sexuality, school problems, maybe a death in the family or a close one, some sort of mental illness, spirituality, pregnancy, other legal issues, eating disorders, and then AIDS is one of the lowest ones. So this was done in 1995, the study that was done looking at the percentage of telephone calls that came in with concerns that teenagers had.